I'm just so overwhelmed because it never felt like we'd get here, and now we're here. We just want to say thank you.
Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 3rd of January 2022. I am joined as ever by my co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman, who is hopefully feeling refreshed following a festive season. How's everything at House Brockman?
We've got the Red Cross on the door, and we're expecting a visit from the doctor with that really fetching sort of birdie mask.
Yes,
we're a plague house.
Oh dear. You've got the Rona, have you, in the house?
Rona is visiting. Yes, Rona is currently visiting our daughter and her boyfriend.
Oh dear.
And fortunately, in all seriousness, fortunately, they're not too bad at the moment, and we wish everyone well, and under the circumstances, Happy New Year to you and our viewer.
Indeed, yes. Happy as can be, I suppose. Happy New Year, folks. It's good to be back. We didn't manage a Christmas New Year live stream. We may well do something towards the end of January as like a bit of fun. But life.
We could do it. We could do it for Burns Night or Chinese New Year.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Some neeps and tatties, that should be good.
Absolutely.
A wee bit of haggis as well. Anyway, what's been happening this week? What are we going to discuss? I don't think there's anything really major in the news this week, is there?
There's absolutely no major news from a heritage point of view whatsoever. It's been so quiet. No, of course, that is. We're actually kidding you, dear viewer, because there's actually a pretty major story which we're going to be discussing.
Oh, would that be the major story where our Prime Minister has got a headline in today's Daily Mail: "Vandals can't change our history"?
Might be. It might be this. It might be the same one where the Attorney General, who's the government minister, who's basically in charge of the law, is probably about to get a lesson in the law from the from the judiciary if she carries on the way she's going. But anyway, we'll come to that later.
Okay. Well, let us begin at the beginning, shall we? Once upon a time, folks, there was a statue in Bristol. And what happened to that statue, Andy?
The statue, as our regular viewer will probably know, was to a man called Sir Edward Colston. Sir Edward Colston was one of the great and the good of Bristol in the 17th into the 18th century. He came from a local family of prominent merchants and was involved in an organisation called the Society of Merchant Venturers, which still exists and has been an influence on the city of Bristol for a long time now. It's a sort of an organisation which has a great deal of influence, or has had a great deal of influence on the way the city has been run, and its public face. Colston is most famous now because he was not just associated with the Society of Merchant Venturers, but also something called the Royal Africa Company, and eventually rising to be a very senior officer of the Royal African Company. Now, the Royal African Company basically traded in enslaved African men, women, and children. It transported enslaved people from Africa to primarily British possessions in the Caribbean to work on the sugar plantations, and it's estimated that hundreds of thousands of people were stolen from their homes and then transported during the time that Colston was actually involved with the company.
So people were their product.
People were their product, and Colston made a lot of money at it, out of it, as did Bristol as a city. Now, Colston didn't have any heirs, and he had a vast fortune, and so he made the decision, as a lot of the great and the good did at that time, that he would put money into good works. Good works, at least as far as white people were concerned back in Bristol. And he endowed a school, which still exists, And over the years after his death in 1721, his name became attached to many other aspects of city life in Bristol. He was commemorated in a concert hall, names of roads, names of other schools. There was a stained glass window in Bristol Cathedral, other monuments. So he was a significant figure in the history of Bristol, but an increasingly controversial one. Now, in 1895, there was a move to erect a statue to commemorate his life and his place as a
benefactor,
as a benefactor to Bristolians. At a place close to what's called the Floating Harbour. It's the docks in Bristol where, in Colston's lifetime, the ships involved in what's often called the slave trade triangle would have docked, where enslaved African people who were being brought to England would have been disembarked. Colston was there on a plinth overlooking the docks, in his full dress clothes, bewigged and all the rest of it. And this was put up in as I say, in the mid 1890s. Interestingly, and perhaps as a measure of how Colston was already a controversial character, it was meant to have been put up by public subscription, but in fact, the public subscription campaign failed. It's like a GoFundMe campaign to put the statue up in 1895. It actually failed, and it only went up because of the individual contributions of senior members of Bristol Society and the Society of Merchant Venturers. So it can't be said that it was a popular statue in the first place.
No, so it was people of his class celebrating actually their own class, really, because the guy was long dead.
That's a reasonable summary.
Yeah.
That's a reasonable summary. Now, if we fast forward to the late 20th, early 21st century, Bristol has become a massively multicultural city. There's a very famous part of the city called St Paul's, which became famous for being the area where a lot of black people moved to. It had a very vibrant cafe and music culture. I lived in Bristol in the early 80s and lived in St Paul's, and it was then, as it is now, it was a very creative city. Lots of artistic and media people.
Aardman Animations, I believe.
Aardman Animations grew out of Bristol. It has had a thriving theatre scene, a thriving band scene, and it was a very modern, very vibrant city. And with that came examinations, and some quite hard examinations, of Bristol's history. And the statue of Colston became a sort of touchstone, really, as to how Bristol was changing.
Notably, though, that it was this statue in a city full of statues. This is something that historian David Olusoga pointed out a couple of days ago. There was a reason for this statue becoming that touchstone. This wasn't like a citywide, ire against public statuary, as it were.
That's right. It was particularly Colston's direct links to being, direct responsibility in the enslavement of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of African people. And the idea that somebody who had committed what are now seen effectively as crime, genuinely, what are now seen as crimes.
Well, human trafficking.
Someone who made a vast fortune out of human trafficking should be in a position of, as you say, pride in the city, in the city, for people to walk past and to literally look up to, because it was high up on a plinth. So, cutting to the chase, there have been campaigns over various periods to have the statue taken down. May the 25th, 2020, as people may well remember, George Floyd, who's a black American, was murdered by a police officer who knelt on his neck for 8 minutes, 46 seconds and suffocated him. Now, understandably, that set off reverberations and revulsion around the world, and kicked off the so-called Black Lives Matter movement.
Certainly gave it more energy, shall we say? I think it was already going before then.
Well, yeah, it became an international movement, and including in Bristol. Now, Bristolians began to plan a Black Lives Matter protest for Sunday, June 7th. And that included promoting a petition to remove the statue of Colston. Now, the petition had actually been set up several years earlier on the 38 Degrees website, but it hadn't gained much traction, but suddenly it was gaining a lot of traction. The name of Colston was being mentioned in the Bristol media. Some places associated with Colston, like schools, had already changed their name to disassociate themselves from Colston. And the Colston Hall, which is one of the main concert halls in Bristol, had already announced it was going to be changing its name. It had just undergone a £50 million rebuild to bring it up to state-of-the-art standards. And it was recognised that being named after a leading people trafficker and slave trader wasn't really a good look. So things were already starting to happen, but the statue was still there, and there was no sign that the city authorities and the elected mayor were going to prioritise taking it down. On Sunday, June the 7th, there was a gathering of around 10 to 15,000 people who took part in the demonstration. And it appears that in the immediate period before the demonstration, some people had decided that they were going to pull down the statue. Now, this is something that was already again going on in the States with some of these so-called Confederate statues, statues commemorating the slave-owning class in the American Civil War.
But again, often put up during Jim Crow. So again, their historicity is up for discussion and debate in terms of actually how directly connected they are, in fact, to the Civil War, as opposed to reinforcing, a little bit like Colston and his class of merchants, a status of a group of people, as opposed to actually memorializing a historical event or historical person. Anyway, sorry, continue.
But that's right. So basically, during the demonstration, a group of those people, quite a large group of those people, put ropes around the neck of the statue. It was pulled down onto the ground. It was kicked. It was daubed with paint, and it was dragged to Bristol Harbour and dumped in Bristol Harbour. The police chose not to intervene in this.
Yes.
It was an operational decision to avoid provoking the crowd, it would appear. Anyway, Avon Somerset Police, which is the police force that was responsible, announced afterwards that they were immediately beginning an investigation into possible criminal damage. Now, because it was a listed structure, there was an aggravating factor in that. It was the property of Bristol City Council, who hold it in trust for the people of Bristol. So they were the aggrieved party, if you like, in this. But it immediately becomes, again, an international issue. The images, and I'm sure our viewers will be familiar with the images of the statue being pulled through the streets and then particularly dumped into the harbour, and then actually very swiftly afterwards, the day afterwards, lifted out again by Bristol Council. And the statue was lifted out and put into storage. After a police investigation and a referral to the Crown Prosecution Service, which is the way these things are done, and allegedly, let's say, interventions by Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, the decision was made to prosecute 4 people who had taken part in that action. Now, it is very clear from the number of people that were involved as opposed to the number of people who were actually finally charged that, in a sense, it was seen as a prosecution because they had to pour encourager les autres. There was a debate that argued that, what would a prosecution be seen as defending effectively the reputation of a slave trader, a people trafficker, and was it appropriate? It was decided, for whatever reason, to undertake the prosecution, and just before Christmas, 4 people were charged and brought before the Crown Court in Bristol, having elected to go to a Crown Court jury trial, not a magistrate's trial, which would probably have seen them convicted and fined straight away. They chose to fight the case in front of a jury.
Now, it's worthwhile just saying, it's not. This isn't just about defending the ownership of a statue of a slave trader. It's fair. It is fair to say, and it is true to say, that they did destroy a listed monument that was owned by the city council. And I made the point a little earlier that this is a city full of statues, but in this instance they directed their aggression against this particular statue for reasons that they deemed to be reasonable. But nonetheless, the prosecution, I think, is legitimate in so much as it was actually an act of vandalism against a protected monument owned for the public by the city council. So it's not just that. It's not. There's more going on than just whether or not it's right to defend the personage of Colston.
Absolutely. In objective terms, what happened was a heritage crime.
Yes.
And the 4 people and the 4 people concerned, that they've become known as the Colston Four. It's Milo Ponsford, Sage Willoughby, Jake Skuse, and Rhian Graham, who's become something of a spokesperson since the trial ended a few days ago. The 4 of them were charged with criminal damage, and faced trial, as I say, in Bristol Crown Court. Now, on January the 5th, 2 days ago, the jury was sent out to consider the verdict in the trial, which had gone on over several days over the Christmas period. Witnesses.
What a Christmas present for them all.
Well, absolutely.
How wonderful.
But I mean, there are many accounts of the trial in the media, and there are accounts of evidence by people like David Olusoga, who's Bristolian himself, and gave evidence for the defence on the role of Colston in slave trade and so on. But basically, the jury, after only about 2.5-3 hours deliberation, on a majority, so it means at least 10 of them were agreeing on the verdict. It wasn't a unanimous verdict. At least 10 of them agreed that Ponsford, Willoughby, Skuse, and Graham were not guilty, which means they left the court without a stain on their character, and they can't be tried for this again. Much as certain parts of the media and the commentariat would quite like it to happen, and I think we're going to come on to that in a moment.
Well, it's an interesting one, this, because this morning, for example, I've been having a conversation with someone. I say a conversation; it was a heated discussion with someone about this, simply on the basis of the notion of the destruction of history. And I hinted at this when it came to our Prime Minister writing a massive headline in the Daily Mail in shouty words, they cannot change our history. But in this instance, we're talking about the toppling of a single statue in a city, as I say, full of statues. One statue on a day 2 years ago, which has not led to the destruction of our society. It hasn't become a slippery slope as was being described to me, and yet, oddly enough, this is being described as something which is attempting to change or sanitize history. This notion that it's trying to deny history, this toppling of a single statue for very particular contextual reasons. And the thing that fascinates me, archaeologically speaking, as I say, this is a heritage crime, and there are reasons to prosecute this without a doubt. And also, I'm not necessarily saying that I would have done it myself. I don't think I would actually necessarily have wanted to do it like that myself. But it all depends on context and how long you've been living there and the the communal feelings towards the statue. But archaeologically speaking, as objectively as I can, there are a few things that come to mind. If you don't mind me rambling just for a little bit longer. And,
No, I've rambled for quite a bit already. So ramble away.
So thing number one, archaeologically speaking, a statue that's still standing is almost certainly not yet at the end of its life. Statues are the focus of public and political and symbolic action all the time. So sometimes they are deliberately toppled, other times through wear and tear and erosion, statues fall. Almost in fact, I'd be willing to bet 99% of Roman statues that we have in museums were found on their sides. So statues that are standing up are not at the end of their life, almost certainly. Second, in the case of Colston, and I am reading from some notes here, the sanitization of history, it occurs to me, was actually in erecting this statue decades after the man had died, in fact, more than 150 years after he had died, in the context of an empire where slavery had been apparently abolished in the early 1800s, that presented him as a figure of unalloyed admiration. As it were, an inert symbol of a class of merchant without any other context. This was an empire without most forms of slavery, as many people are quick to point out in these conversations. We abolished slavery, and yet in this instance we have a statue being put up without saying this guy, by the way, made most of his money, or a significant chunk of his money. I don't know the exact figures, from the trafficking of enslaved humans. So that there's a problem there, again, as objectively as I can muster. And finally, this notion of trying to sanitize history, that's sanitization, this notion of just presenting, oh, here's just a merchant, he's a good merchant for the city of Bristol. On the charge of people who toppled him trying to destroy history, not a single person there is wanting us to ignore Colston, ignore, as it were, as they might say, his crimes against humanity, or indeed to ignore the route by which so much wealth flowed into the city of Bristol. If anything, it's drawing attention to that fact. It's actually adding to the historical record and the narrative, as opposed to allowing people just to meander past Colston and think, what a nice old man who brought lovely things to this city. That's not destroying or changing history. That's ensuring that the history is not forgotten. And one final thing, because again, often in these conversations, it's a very similar bunch of people. For example, recently we came head to head with such people over the notion of Magna Carta, providing defence against COVID measures and closing of businesses. In this instance, we have a victory in court, or we certainly have a conclusion to a trial with a jury of peers whose rights are actually set down in the version of Magna Carta that made it through to the final draft. So this is actually one of the fundamental rights in this country, to be tried by a jury of peers. They elected to do that, and they've been found not guilty. So if you love history, then you want more of it, surely. If you love this country, then you love our wonderful jury-led trial system and expert judiciary. And if you're interested in Bristol's history and heritage and its ongoing story, then hopefully you're going to be engaging in a conversation about what happens next. And also where maybe we put this statue so that we can reflect on it and to think about it and talk about it, as opposed to just wanting to put it back where it was and never talk about this problem again. I can't think of a reasonable objective stance other than that, because I'm not Bristolian, I'm not Black African, but I can see that the argument for just ignoring it is deeply flawed. I'll hand back over to you.
Okay, look.
Sorry. My lord.
hand over the hottest of hot potatoes.
Yeah, exactly. Case.
No, look.
closed. No, go on.
No, in the end, what we're dealing with here and the reactions we're dealing with here, and again, there is so much material now out there that's come out in the last couple of days in terms on both sides of the argument, on all sides of the argument. We are dealing with what has been set up as a battle in the so-called culture war.
Yeah.
And that is being used, that is being thrown up as chaff to obscure the legal realities of what's happened.
Yes.
Of what that jury did.
Yeah. Because it should be clear, this isn't inevitably going to lead down a slippery slope where things that are offensive or things that are uncomfortable are destroyed. I often bring up in these conversations, I haven't yet brought it up, but I often bring up the case of, for example, Liverpool, where they very carefully maintain symbols of the slave trade in that city. So we don't forget. It's just that in this instance, this was a very particular figure, and it was, as I say, historically inert. It was not holding him in the proper context. Sorry, go ahead.
No, what I was going to say was developing what you have just pointed out, that as one of the defence barristers told the press afterwards, cases are decided on their evidence. This is, the jury decided on the evidence that was put in front of them that the four weren't guilty of criminal damage as they've been charged. And there were very specific chains of evidence that were put in front of them about Bristol, about Bristol's relationship with the slave trade, about Colston himself, about the Royal African Company, and so on and so on and so on. So it contrary to what a lot of right-wing and pro-culture war commentators have been saying, and I'll just quote you, Michael Fabricans, Conservative MP. I've tabled a written question to the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, asking whether she will amend the law on criminal damage following the acquittal of the, quotes, Colston 4 on a legal loophole, as this could give rise to other statues being damaged. This obsession with statues. Statues are being used as a proxy for basically ideas of history which I think are fantastic, but you might not agree with. Fabricants is getting something fundamentally wrong there, as are many of the MPs who weighed in on this, even some who are lawyers. Robert Jenrick, who recently left the cabinet, former community secretary. We undermine the rule of law which underpins our democracy if we accept vandalism and criminal damage are acceptable forms of political protest. They aren't, regardless of the intentions. This did not set a legal precedent. What happened was that jury, using rights, as you say, set out in Magna Carta, but which underpin the entire British legal system, that jury acted entirely within its rights to interpret the evidence that it had been shown in a way which meant that it chose to acquit the four accused. That has happened. There is nothing, quite rightly, that the government can do about it, however much people might huff and puff. That is a done deal.
Now, the thing that's interesting here, and this is where I'm going to be slightly devil's advocate, is just to return back to this to the simple fact that actually, by definition, vandalism occurred. Destruction of public property occurred. So it happened, but a jury of peers who actually, again, going back to a conversation I was having this morning, who actually do represent local people by definition, because they were trying to make the case that these four people didn't actually represent locals, that they were simply a loud minority. This jury, in the context of the city and its history, its actual history, and the action in and around the statue on that day, decided to deem them not guilty. Now, I don't know to what extent you know this, so I'm just going to ask: do we know whether it was essentially a notion of mitigating factors? Is that kind of what we're getting at here?
Right. Okay. Now, again, there's another fundamental thing about jury trials, in that juries never give their reasons for their verdicts, and it is actually illegal to try and find out or to talk about the deliberations of the jury.
Right. Okay.
That is it is seen as absolutely fundamental to the purity and effectiveness of the jury system.
Yeah.
That jurors have that protection.
Okay.
Right.
But as a matter of public record, we know what they were presented with, and we know the conclusion they came to. Yeah.
Precisely. We can speculate what the discussion was, and in fact, anyone who wants to know more about this and understand the legal background to this, there is a very it's quite a long read, but it's a very lucidly written read by the blogger called The Secret Barrister. Some people out there may have read one of The Secret Barrister's books. There are two now talking about the legal system. It's some of the most up-to-date and sharp and thoughtful legal commentary there is. And there is this blog post specifically about the Colston trial, which we'll link to below the line. But it goes into all the potential legal arguments and how they might have been seen by the jury, but basically ending up concluding we don't know.
No.
But what it's absolutely clear is that two things: one, it's not a precedent in legal terms, and secondly, it's not an affront to the rule of law. In fact, it shows that the rule of law is actually working.
So someone couldn't use this case as a defense for toppling, say, Winston Churchill. It'd have to be judged on its merits and so on.
Absolutely, absolutely. As the defence barrister said, every case is decided on the evidence within that case.
I suppose finally, a question that I brought to you, or that I pointed out to you just before we started recording. Should we consider the judge in this case to be a leftist stooge?
Oh, for goodness sake.
Answer the question, Andy.
Some people might consider. Look, just read the Secret Barrister's blog. No, look. This was the British legal establishment, British legal system at work. The point is that people who, and I'm using the words of the Secret Barrister piece here, people who disagreed with the verdict of the jury seem to be eliding the rule of law, in quote marks, for, in quote marks, an outcome I agree with. In other words, had they been convicted, it would have been a fantastic example of the rule of law punishing the guilty.
They threw their book at them.
Precisely. And in fact, the judge, if you read the judge's summing up, the judge was absolutely clear that the jury should make their decision based on the law and the evidence as it had been presented to them, exactly what they're supposed to do. There was no hint that there was any kind of sympathy for the, it's nonsensical to suggest that if you read what was actually said, it's nonsensical to make suggestions like that. And I've seen people falling back on commentary about woke police not intervening, woke judges overseeing a system that's an affront to the rule of law. It's nonsense. The system worked as it is supposed to. One of the questions is whether the Home Secretary intervened inappropriately right at the beginning of the process to ensure that there were prosecutions. That is something that will be worked out over the next weeks and months as people find out more about what actually went on behind the scenes. The media have been somewhat hobbled in discussing those sorts of issues while the trial's in preparation because of contempt laws. Now that the trial's concluded, things like that can be actually discussed in more detail. We found out just this morning, for example, that GB News, and also actually, to be fair, a local news website, almost faced contempt of court charges for their coverage of the trial.
Interesting.
So, and more like that will come in, and saying particularly the involvement of Whitehall and particularly the Home Secretary, Priti Patel. She is alleged to have spoken to the Chief Constable of Avon and Somerset, and shall we say, suggested that it would be the government would be very happy if prosecutions took place. in fact that they had to take place.
Good boy. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Well, what a way to start the year, Andy. Happy New Year indeed, 2022. It's a bright new, shiny, uncontroversial watching brief for everyone to watch at home and to listen to, obviously, where you can get hold of this in audio form. I suppose just very finally, we are at the end of our time. Is there any final thing that you would say to this in terms of any final comments that maybe haven't occurred to you in the context of our conversation?
No, I mean, we did discuss this at the time.
Yes.
We'll
link to that
statue
as
of Toppling.
well.
Yeah, absolutely. Our original watching brief discussion about the Colston statue.
Yeah.
As somebody who's lived in Bristol, who likes Bristol very much as a city,
Mm-hmm.
and but also as a historian and archaeologist, someone who cares about the past, I think this is probably the right ending for this particular story. The statue is still available. It's back in storage at the moment, but it has been on display. I've no doubt it will go on display again.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly and quite amusingly, Rhian Graham, one of the Colston Four, has done an op-ed piece for The Guardian, where she writes that although they couldn't mention it at the time, they were told when they were preparing their defence that in purely monetary terms, the Colston statue is now worth more, now that it's been toppled and it's set in storage, daubed with paint, than it was when it sat on top of that plinth. It was a late 19th century civic statue. It's more valuable now than it was previously.
I mean, that's kind of by the by, though, isn't it, really, in terms of this actual conversation? It's not really.
It is, but I think it's important to stress, though, that the statue was not destroyed.
No.
It was forcibly moved from where it was, and then picked out of the docks by the council and taken to where it is now in the council museum store. But nothing has been destroyed, nothing has been suppressed. If anything,
we can still talk about it. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
And if anything can be talked about more openly.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I suppose the final thing I would say is just hopefully people have watched all of this video before they've commented below, because, for example, as I say, I'm not remotely trying to say that technically at the moment of it occurring, that the people couldn't have known that laws were probably being broken. If you see what I mean, I'm not trying to overturn the jury there. What I'm saying is, there are reasons there's a reason, arguably, why it went to trial. And
look, okay, let's put it into a timeline.
Yeah.
The statue existed.
Mm-hmm.
The statue was pulled down.
Mm-hmm.
There was a prima facie case for criminal damage.
The statue existed. The statue was listed. The statue was pulled down.
Yes,
yeah.
The statue was pulled down. There was a prima facie case for criminal damage, of which a representative, a sample of the people who were involved in that process were put on trial. They opted to go to a jury trial. The evidence was put before the jury. The judge told the jury to make their judgment on the law and on the evidence they being presented with. And the jury, as is absolutely their right, even though the defendants had admitted their participation, not their guilt, their participation, the jury chose to acquit. That is the system working.
Yeah.
And I think there's one other piece of historical perspective I would add just to finish, and that is anybody who has studied the history of monumentalization, of commemoration in the public sphere, will be familiar with a concept that in Latin is called damnatio memoriae. It was done in Egypt, it was done in Rome, where that particular phrase comes from. It was that if somebody, for whatever reason, offended the state, the law, whatever, they could be literally written out. Their monuments would be destroyed or repurposed.
Yeah.
The cartouches of pharaohs like Akhenaten are literally just chiseled out on their monuments.
Yeah, names removed, noses removed. Yeah.
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the most famous symbols of Roman Britain, the head of the Emperor Claudius, that was pulled out of a river near Colchester, was probably just from a statue that was destroyed by Boudicca's rebels.
Yeah.
So this is not new.
No, it's not. No,
this is
no.
It's not something that started with Black Lives Matter.
No. And as I say, archaeologically, if anything, it is inevitable that statues are acted upon and the statues end up on their side, if not
exactly. They're very public statements and touchstones, which makes them uniquely available for people to make very physical comments on, and that's what happened here. And the jury decided, as is entirely proper, that the 4 people who were charged did nothing wrong.
No. And the second and final thing I was going to say was just, it's very simple. Historians and archaeologists are not in the business of erasing history. No. The more voices there are, the wider the historical narrative becomes.
Yes.
And if anything, I suppose what I would encourage people to consider is the simple fact that the notion of a true history is one that is very difficult to stack up. If one person is telling you what history is, or if one group of people are telling you what history is, then there's probably more to the story. And that is what an honest historian and archaeologist is interested in. And that's, in this instance, primarily what I'm interested in, as opposed to having preconceived ideas as to what is valid. What I'm interested in is what's happened and what does it tell us about the context of what happened and why it happened and who it happened to and so on. And in many ways, as you say, the value has been added to in terms of monetary value, but NFTs are a thing at the moment, so who knows what any of that actually means. But as a story, as a future historical story, this is interesting. It's really interesting, and hopefully, in the future, people will be able to look at this as a historical event, and its history. Anyway, you probably need to go and chillax and prepare for your oncoming date with Corona, possibly being in the plague city such as you are. And to be fair, I've had a terrible cold over the weekend as well, so it's just as well that we should bring it to a close. Do keep an eye out, guys, for a potential live stream later this month. We do want to do that quiz and have a bit of fun, so we'll give that a go. And any word on what next week's story might be, Andy, or stories?
No, in a word. There are as well as the regular archaeology news, and we're going to be doing a media pick as well in the near future. There's been a lot of archaeology TV on recently, so we're going to be talking about that. No doubt there will be a piece of extreme muppetry will occur at some point. There are pipeline stories coming up.
There are things in the pipeline.
I see what you did there. I was about to do the same thing.
Sorry.
That's all right. There's a number of what I think could be quite significant stories coming up. So we'll watch this space. And in the meantime, the Colston story is fascinating. Read the Secret Barrister's blog, because that is probably the best exposition of the legal issues. But read around it and please join the debate and comment below the line.
Excellent. Yeah. Grand. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I'm just so overwhelmed because it never felt like we'd get here, and now we're here. We just want to say thank you.